CBS News senior national security analyst Juan Zarate joins us from Washington. So, Juan, I guess the question is now, how will the U.S. respond to this type of quote-unquote simulated attack?
Well, Elaine, you've already heard from the White House and U.S. officials that they're going to issue diplomatic protests. So that will be very clear. They're protesting to the Russian government that this is unacceptable, including very dangerous because of the potential for miscalculation. So there's going to be pushback diplomatically. The U.S. is also going to talk to its NATO allies because this is not just an issue for the U.S., it's an issue for all of NATO. NATO forces have been strafed and challenged by the Russian armed forces in recent months in a variety of ways. This is the latest episode and most egregious, I would say. So no doubt there are going to be meetings with NATO partners to talk about how to posture. In addition, I think the U.S. is going to try to place naval and Air Force presence in these areas to demonstrate that the U.S. won't be deterred from traveling in international waters where it has a right to be. And finally, I think there's going to be some intense military-to-military exchanges because not only does this not follow treaty obligations signed in the early 1970s, but it's just not good maritime and armed forces practices. This is reckless. It has the potential for causing miscalculation and conflict. And frankly, the next time this happens, if it's a simulated attack, a question might be asked as to why the U.S. forces aren't fighting back, defending themselves, because you're not quite sure what the intent of these air forces from the Russian services, what they're trying to do. And so lots of questions. The U.S. is going to have an all-out sort of barrage here diplomatically as well as with its allies to try to push back on the Russians and make sure this doesn't happen again.
Yeah, and I mean, Juan, in David's piece, he said that this happened not once or twice, but 31 times over 2 days. So certainly would seem to be deliberate. But what's the point? I mean, what is the objective here on the part of the Russians?
Well, the Russian bear has been flexing its muscle for some time in the context of the Ukraine and Crimea. Certainly, we've seen this in the context of Syria. But in its near abroad, along its borders, the Russians have wanted to push back against NATO forces and trying to send a very clear signal that Russia is in control of its territory, and that the U.S. and NATO forces are not going to be allowed free rein in the near abroad, certainly in the Baltic Sea, where the Russians feel they have real interests at play. It's also part of a diplomatic and political game. These are symbolic actions, not to mention real military actions, that then have a way of influencing. They're trying to influence what's happening in the Baltic countries, in their near abroad. And so this is part of that diplomatic as well as political dance and choreography where the Russians are trying to demonstrate that they can fight back, they can bite back, and they're pushing back on NATO forces.
And Juan, you talked a little bit about this, but how dangerous is this for the vessels involved? I mean, you look at that video and you look at the pictures, it's remarkable just how close they were. I'm wondering, how dangerous is this, and also how quickly could things have escalated under those circumstances?
Well, it's incredibly dangerous, Elaine, and one of the reasons this is dangerous is not only were the Russians not following sort of accepted protocols, long-standing protocols between the armed services, but they also weren't responding to communications. And so the naval vessels didn't quite know what the Russian pilots were intending. And I think that's hugely dangerous, especially when you have attack simulations underway and lack of clarity as to what the Russians are really trying to do. One news report I saw, Elaine, was that some of these flybys were so close that it was causing wakes in the water along the vessels. That's how close this was. And all you need is one miscalculation, one misperception of intent, perhaps even some of these automatic defensive systems to be on, and you've got a real military incident and conflict on your hands.
Serious situation there. Juan Zarate, thanks so much for your analysis.
Thank you, Elaine.